Hello everyone and welcome. I am the Congressman and today we're going to talk about duels. Specifically, duels between congressmen. But even more specifically, the 1838 duel between Representatives Jonathan Cilley and William Graves. This is the story of the only fatal duel between congressmen in United States history. On February 24, 1838, a group of 12 men left Washington, D.C. for Bladensburg, Maryland, just outside the northeast boundary of the federal district. 10 of these 12 men were members of the United States House of Representatives, and the point of this little field trip was that two of them, Jonathan Cilley of Maine and William Graves of Kentucky, were going to have a duel. Now, duels were, of course, not uncommon at the time. This was hardly the first time congressmen had dueled. This wasn't even the first time congressmen had dueled each other. But in the majority of cases, they actually ended peacefully. For every high-profile fatal duel, such as that of Hamilton and Burr in 1804, there were dozens of duels that ended with the two guys just shaking hands and moving on, sometimes without even firing a shot. But on this day in 1838, that would not be the case. On this day, only one of these two men is coming back to Washington, D.C. alive. Jonathan Cilley was born July 2, 1802 in Nottingham, New Hampshire. His parents were Greenleaf Cilley and Jane Neely Cilley. His grandfather was Joseph Cilley, a decorated Revolutionary War veteran, and his uncle was United States Representative Bradbury Cilley. Young Jonathan attended Atkinson Academy, which, holy shit, is still around today. After that, he went to college at Bowdoin, which is also still around today, but that's, way more common with colleges than elementary schools. At any rate, he graduated from Bowdoin in 1825, in the same class as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Also, during his time in school, he formed a close friendship with future Congressman and President Franklin Pierce, who was a year ahead of him. Also, it's a damn shame that Jonathan Cilley isn't included in this list of notable alumni. After college, Cilley moved to Thomaston, Maine, where he studied law for several years under another future congressman by the name of John Ruggles. Cilley was admitted to the bar in 1828 and immediately set up his own practice. He also worked as an editor of a newspaper called the Thomaston Register. Less is known about the early years of William Graves. He was born sometime in 1805 in Henry County, Kentucky, in an area that would later be incorporated as the town of Newcastle. His parents were William Graves and Lydia Williams Graves. Speaking of Graves, the elder Graves' tombstone inscription reads, "A soldier under Anthony Wayne, 1779. But the elder Graves was 11 years old at that time, so probably not. At any rate, the younger William Graves, our William Graves, also studied law and was also admitted to the bar in the late 1820s. Graves and Cilley followed remarkably similar career paths over the next several years. Both men practiced law, both men got married and had several children, they both lost half those children in infancy, and both men ended up getting elected to their state legislatures. Jonathan Cilley was elected to the Maine House of Representatives in 1831, and William Graves was elected to the Kentucky House of Representatives in 1834. Before we get to the part where they joined Congress, though, we need to bring in a third main character. Now, this man was not one of the 12 who traveled to Bladensburg on February 24, 1838, nor was he a congressman, but he was the instigator of the entire thing. Meet James Watson Webb, a 36-year-old newspaper editor from New York City. And yes, I said 36. This picture is from 1860, but it's the only one I could find, so, just picture this, but 30 years younger. Anyway, Webb had been a lieutenant in the Army, and after resigning that commission in 1827, he purchased a newspaper called the Morning Courier. He used his newspaper to promote the presidential campaign of Andrew Jackson. He and Jackson were successful, and in 1829, Webb purchased another newspaper called the New York Enquirer. He combined his two papers into the New York Courier and Enquirer. Webb was loud and he was tough, and so unsurprisingly, he was no stranger to confrontation. He fought 2 duels during his time in the Army. And in his career as a newspaper editor, he threatened, caned, horsewhipped, and dueled with his antagonists, and was himself threatened, beaten, and shot. Webb was also a frequent visitor to Washington, both as a newspaperman getting information to report on, but also as a fighting man ready to defend his name against any perceived slight. In 1830, he attacked a fellow newspaper editor by the name of Duff Green, solid name by the way, on the Capitol steps in broad daylight. By 1835, all 3 men were moving up their respective paths. Jonathan Cilley was elected Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, William Graves had been elected to the United States Congress from Kentucky's 8th District, and in New York, James Watson Webb had become one of the city's foremost newspapermen. However, while he started out as a staunch Jacksonian Democrat, Webb was now firmly opposed to Jackson. He used his newspaper to support Henry Clay and the new National Republican Party in the 1832 presidential election. Soon after, that party evolved into the Whig Party, a term allegedly coined by Webb himself. The change in Webb's politics can't really be pinpointed to one specific thing, but almost certainly the Bank of the United States had something to do with it. See, President Jackson hated the National Bank. There's a famous bit of trivia that one day Vice President Van Buren came across Jackson lying exhausted on a couch. He said, "What's wrong, Mr. President?" And Jackson said, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren. The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Webb, when he was a Jackson supporter, also hated the bank. But in 1831, a funny thing happened. Webb received 3 loans from the bank totaling just under $53,000, and after that, his newspaper started supporting the bank and opposing Jackson. Now, to be sure, Webb's total change in politics was almost certainly a bit more nuanced and more gradual than that, but the point is that he was against the bank, then he got the loans, then he supported the bank. That's the part that's going to be important in a few minutes. In 1836, Jonathan Cilley was elected to the United States House of Representatives from Maine's 3rd District, and William Graves was re-elected from Kentucky's 8th District. Both men arrived in Washington for the start of the first session in September of 1837. One of them only had 5 months to live. On January 23, 1838, the House was debating the ongoing war in Florida against the Seminoles. Virginia Representative Henry Wise, a Whig, was criticizing Democratic President Martin Van Buren and his administration's policies regarding that war. Don't worry about the specifics, it doesn't matter to our story. Cilley, a Democrat, rose to respond to Wise. Mr. Cilley defended the policy of the government, which, he insisted, was humane and benevolent. The sympathy evinced for the tawny red men he described to be of the same character as the hobby professed for the race a little darker in the North. To put it another way, Cilley implied that Whigs like Henry Wise cared more about the welfare of the Seminoles than about the white settlers by comparing him to abolitionists in the North who were perceived by Democrats to care more about the welfare of slaves than about that of the white citizens. In short, he said Wise was acting like an abolitionist, which was a remarkably unwise thing to say to a Southerner in 1838. Okay, I'm sorry, that was bad, and I should feel bad. Let me try again. Essentially, he said Wise was acting like an abolitionist, which was a remarkably silly thing to say to a Southerner.
Leave! Get the money from the church collection plate!
Henry Wise had been stewing over Jonathan Cilley's remark for about 3 weeks, but on Monday, February 12th, he was finally able to get his revenge. He showed up to work with a copy of the New York Courier and Enquirer and addressed the House. "Sir, I bring to the attention of the House a direct and unequivocal charge against a member of the Congress of the United States of corruption, a charge which was openly made by the editors of 2 responsible papers of this country who vouch that the charge can be proved by a responsible witness or witnesses." He read directly from the Courier and Enquirer their charge that there is at least one member of Congress who has offered to barter his services and his influence with a department or departments for compensation. According to the writer, the unnamed congressman said, "Things do not go here by merit, but by pulling the right strings. Make it my interest and I will pull the strings for you." Today, of course, we consider that sort of corruption just standard operating procedure, but in 1838, this was a serious charge. Henry Wise motioned for the formation of a committee to investigate it. Jonathan Cilley stood to argue against the motion, saying the House shouldn't jump to form a committee based simply on a vague newspaper piece. This charge comes from an editor of a newspaper, and we all know that in a country where the press is free, few men can expect to escape abuse and charges of a similar description. But then he added, and this is the important part, he knew nothing of this editor, but if it was the same editor who had once made grave charges against an institution of this country and afterwards was said to have received facilities to the amount of some $52,000 from the same institution and gave it his hearty support, he did not think that his charges were entitled to much credit in an American Congress. And that was it. The next day, his remarks were printed in all the newspapers, and in New York City, James Watson Webb was pissed. He immediately set out for Washington to confront Cilley. James Watson Webb arrived in Washington and went straight to the Capitol, but he didn't confront Jonathan Cilley. Instead, this is where William Graves re-enters our story. You see, Webb couldn't confront Cilley directly because something code of honor. Dueling had all sorts of rules of etiquette, commandments some might say, and I don't have time to go into it all here. But the point is that Webb needed someone else to facilitate the confrontation, and while he was at the Capitol, he found Graves. Webb pulled Graves aside and he handed him a letter to deliver to Cilley. Graves naturally thought it was a duel challenge and he didn't want to get involved. But Webb told him that no, it wasn't a challenge, he was simply asking for an explanation. Basically, as per the rules of etiquette, Webb was giving Cilley a chance to either retract his statement or apologize. And so, reassured that he wasn't getting mixed up in a duel, Graves met with Cilley to deliver Webb's letter. This is where things started to go wrong. Jonathan Cilley refused to accept Webb's letter. He didn't know Webb personally and he had no specific grievance with him, and more importantly, he didn't feel like he was required to explain his comments on the House floor to a newspaper editor just because that editor took offense. So he refused to accept the letter. He apologized to Graves for putting him in an awkward spot, but he would not take the letter. And this is key, he did not explain why. Both men went their separate ways and spent the next 2 days consulting with friends as to what they should do next. After consulting with his friends, including Senator Franklin Pierce, Jonathan Cilley had decided to prepare for the possibility of being attacked on the street by James Watson Webb. Now, that may sound ridiculous, but at the time, if you had beef with somebody and that person ignored you, the next logical step was to call them a coward and attack them in the street. And considering that his current antagonist had a history of doing just that, I don't think Cilley was being overly paranoid. Cilley met with fellow Democratic representatives Alexander Duncan of Ohio and John Claiborne of Mississippi. Claiborne warned, "Now, Cilley, for God's sake, don't be drawn into a duel with Mr. Graves." Cilley responded, "No danger of that. Mr. Graves and myself are not enemies. I never had a difficulty with but one person in the House." Meanwhile, William Graves consulted with Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, as well as Representatives Waddy Thompson of South Carolina, and of course, Henry Wise of Virginia. The essence of their advice was that the issue between Cilley and Webb was largely irrelevant. The bigger issue now was that by refusing the letter and refusing to explain why, Cilley had insulted Graves. And as a Southern man of honor, that was something that Graves could not accept. And so, on the morning of February 23rd, Henry Wise delivered a note to Cilley from Graves. "As you have declined accepting a communication which I bore to you from Colonel Webb, and as by your note of yesterday you have refused to decline on grounds which would exonerate me from all responsibility growing out of the affair, I am left no alternative but to ask that satisfaction which is recognized among gentlemen." Later, at around 5 p.m., George W. Jones, the delegate from the Wisconsin Territory, delivered a note to Graves from Cilley. "Your note of this morning has been received. My friend General Jones will make the arrangements suitable to the occasion." On the morning of February 24th, 1838, 12 men left Washington, D.C. for Bladensburg, Maryland. On one side, there was Representative Jonathan Cilley, along with his second, Representative George W. Jones of the Wisconsin Territory, himself a veteran of 4 duels. He also had his doctor, Representative Alexander Duncan of Ohio, and his secondary friends. One was Representative Jesse Bynum of North Carolina, and the other was a man named James W. Schomburg, who had been recruited by Senator Franklin Pierce due to his extensive experience with dueling. Side note, speaking of Pierce, he wanted to be there for Cilley, but Cilley wouldn't let him. 1838 was an election year for Pierce, and Cilley didn't want Pierce to hurt his chances by participating in a duel. Dueling was a very unpopular practice in New England. On the other side, there was Representative William Graves, along with his second, Representative Henry Wise of Virginia. His doctor was a Navy surgeon named Jonathan M. Foltz, and his secondary friends were fellow Kentucky Representatives Richard H. Menifee and John J. Crittenden. The other 2 congressmen on this little field trip were also Kentucky representatives, John Calhoun and Richard Hawes. Knowing their friend William Graves wasn't a great shot, the 2 men followed not far behind the main party, bringing blankets just in case Graves was injured or killed. Since Jonathan Cilley had been the challenged party, he was the one to pick the weapons, and he had chosen rifles at 80 yards. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Congress tried to go about business as usual, but as everyone knew what was going on, it was a little tough to focus. Massachusetts Representative John Quincy Adams later wrote, There was an agitation in the house, different from that which is occasioned by an irritated debate. A restless, uneasy, whispering disposition, clustering into little groups with inquisitive looks, listening ears, and varying reports as one member or another went out of or came into the hall. Over at his boarding house, James Watson Webb found out that Cilley and Graves were about to have a duel instigated by his letter of a few days previous. Horrified, he immediately set out to stop the duel from happening with the most batshit insane plan possible. First, he gathered up a couple of his friends and went to Cilley's boarding house, where they intended to demand that Cilley immediately duel Webb instead of Graves, or at least promise to duel Webb before dueling Graves. If Cilley refused, they would break his arm so that he would be unable to duel anyone. Finding that Cilley was already gone, however, they set out to find the dueling ground, and on the way they came up with a new plan. They would run out onto the field and demand that Cilley immediately duel Webb instead of Graves. If Cilley refused, they would shoot him. If Graves or Wise told them to get off the field, they would shoot Cilley. Their plan failed altogether, though, because they went to the wrong dueling grounds. Not once, not twice, but thrice. By that point, it was well into the afternoon, so, defeated, they went back to Washington to await the results. On the real dueling grounds, both men were ready. George W. Jones counted down for the exchange. Cilley accidentally fired early, before he had fully raised his rifle, and Graves simply missed. The seconds conferred in the middle of the field. Jones said that Graves should be satisfied now, right? Wise countered that nothing had changed. Cilley had snubbed Graves, insulting his honor, and had, as yet, refused to provide an explanation. Now, let me take a minute here to just explain how stupid this really is. Cilley had initially refused to accept the letter because he considered James Watson Webb as a newspaper editor to be beneath his dignity as a congressman, and as such, he didn't want to get drawn into a personal conflict over comments he made on the floor of the House during a debate. It was a perfectly valid reason to refuse the letter, but because he didn't explain any of this to William Graves, his refusal snubbed and insulted him. Cilley could have ended this whole thing right away by claiming privilege of debate. It was a legitimate way to avoid a duel, and it was perfectly within the rules of honor to do so. Cilley could have easily said to Graves, "Hey man, look, this Webb guy is beneath me, and I don't have to answer to him because of something I said on the floor of the House, so, that's why I don't want to take his letter." Explaining that would have prevented the perception of snubbing Graves. In his letter to Cilley, when Graves said, "You have refused to decline on grounds which would exonerate me from all responsibility in this affair," that's what he meant. He was saying, just claim that privilege so I can get out of this situation with my honor intact. That would have prevented the duel. Alternatively, Cilley could have just accepted the letter and then either ignored Webb completely or told him directly that he had privilege of debate and he didn't have to explain himself. Either way, Graves's part in the whole thing would have ended with the delivery of the letter, and that would have prevented this duel. But if Cilley had done any of that, he would have opened himself up to charges of cowardice. If he had claimed privilege of debate right away, then Southern congressmen would have said he was simply too much of a coward to face Webb. Now, in the middle of the duel, it was basically too late to do anything. If he claimed privilege of debate now, he would be accused of taking a cowardly way out to avoid dueling Graves. And so, we have two entire adults, congressmen, shooting rifles at each other in a field in Maryland because one tried to deliver a letter and was snubbed, and the other one was too stubborn to explain why, lest he face charges of cowardice. So, George W. Jones counted off for a second exchange. This time, Graves accidentally fired early before raising his rifle all the way, and Cilley simply missed. The seconds huddled up again. Jones, clearly missing the point, said Cilley had proven himself a brave man by participating in this duel and that it should end here. Wise countered that Cilley still hadn't provided the explanation that Graves wanted. Either claim privilege of debate or give some sort of explanation that would restore Graves's wounded honor. As neither of those things were going to happen, the party prepared for a third exchange. George W. Jones counted them off. This time, they both fired correctly, and while Cilley missed his shot, Graves did not. His shot struck Cilley directly, severing his abdominal aorta, and Jonathan Cilley bled to death in less than 2 minutes. The House formed a committee to investigate the cause and sequence of events of the duel. Ultimately, the committee's recommendation was that William Graves should be expelled and Henry Wise and George W. Jones should be censured. However, when it came time for a vote, the House did nothing. No one was punished. And at first, that may seem shocking, appalling even. But When you think about it, it's really not that surprising at all. See, the reaction to the fatal duel was split not along one spectrum, but two, North and South, and Whig and Democrat. Northerners were outraged. Dueling had been unpopular in the region for some time now, and they saw it as a barbaric and outdated practice. But in the South, dueling was still a major part of the code of honor of the gentlemanly class. So Northerners were pissed and wanted Graves expelled, but Southerners were not only not pissed, but they were proud of Graves for defending his honor. Complicating this was the political spectrum. Graves was a Whig and Cilley was a Democrat. So Democrats were pissed and wanted Graves expelled, but the Whigs were not only not pissed, but they were proud of Graves for standing up to a dastardly Democrat. But political parties weren't perfectly regional. There were Northern Whigs and Southern Democrats, who were all torn as to what should happen here, but for entirely opposite reasons. And honestly, if this happened today, would the reaction really be any different? If Jim Jordan killed Jamie Raskin in a duel, I would be outraged. But if Raskin killed Jordan, would I feel the same way? If we're being honest, probably not. Political polarization has a weird warping effect on our morals. But something did come out of it eventually. Congress did eventually pass a new law enhancing the penalties for dueling within the federal district. 10 years in prison if you killed somebody in a duel, 5 years just for participating in a duel, and 3 years if you attack somebody for refusing a duel challenge. It was nearly impossible to enforce because those penalties were so severe, but, hey, it's something. William Graves was not only not punished, he was re-elected to a third term. He chose not to run again in 1840 and returned to Kentucky when his term ended in 1841. He did one more term in the State House of Representatives in 1843, and he died at the age of 42 or 43 on September 27, 1848 in Louisville. Henry Wise was re-elected several more times, ultimately serving in the House until 1844, when President John Tyler appointed him minister to Brazil. Later, in 1856, he became governor of Virginia. It was in that capacity that he orchestrated the trial and execution of John Brown after his failed raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Immediately after the end of his term, he became a strong advocate for Virginia's secession, and when the Civil War started, he served as a general in the Confederate Army, where his most notable achievement was fighting with a fellow general about who had the higher rank. Wise was with General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrendered. After the war, Henry Wise wrote a letter to Ulysses S. Grant with the following jaw-droppingly disingenuous statement. "The chief consolation I have in the result of the war is that slavery is forever abolished, that not only the slaves are in fact at least freed from bondage, but that I am freed from them. Long before the war, indeed, I had definitely made up my mind actively to advocate emancipation throughout the South. I had determined, if I could help it, my descendants should never be subject to the humiliation I had been subject to by the weakness, if not the wickedness, of slavery." Sure, Henry. He then retired to private life as a lawyer. Tragically, though, Henry Wise lived a long and full life. He finally died at the age of 69 on September 12, 1876 in Richmond. George W. Jones of the Wisconsin Territory lost his bid for re-election. Of all 10 congressmen present for the Cilley-Graves duel, Jones was the only one not re-elected to the next term. By the way, he lost that election to James Doty, the guy who had just a couple years earlier founded the town of Madison. Anyway, Jones was appointed Surveyor General of the Wisconsin Territory by President Martin Van Buren, and then he was appointed Surveyor General of the Iowa Territory by President James Polk. When Iowa became a state, Jones became one of its first 2 senators. He stayed in the Senate until 1859 when President James Buchanan appointed him minister to New Granada, in what is today Colombia and Panama. He returned to Iowa after a couple years and retired to private life. He didn't die until July 22, 1896 in Dubuque at the age of 92. And finally, James Watson Webb. His reputation took a pretty big hit in the immediate aftermath of the duel, but he managed to put it behind him 4 years later by participating in another duel with another congressman. This time it was in New York, and his enemy was Representative Thomas F. Marshall of Kentucky, a nephew of former Chief Justice John Marshall. No one died, but Webb was shot in the leg. And then he was arrested and convicted for the duel, but before he could serve his 2-year prison term, he was pardoned by the governor of New York, a future senator and Alaska purchaser called William H. Seward. Later, Webb was appointed minister to Austria by President Zachary Taylor, but the Senate never confirmed the appointment, and then Taylor died, so that didn't work. Later still, President Abraham Lincoln appointed Webb minister to Turkey. This time, the Senate confirmed the nomination, but Webb decided that particular appointment wasn't lucrative enough, so he declined. But the third time was a charm when Lincoln appointed Webb minister to Brazil instead. This time, he accepted. He spent 8 years in Brazil until he was accused of extorting money from the Brazilian government. What a character. Anyway, in 1869, Webb returned to New York and retired to private life. He ultimately died on June 7, 1884, in New York City. And that was the story of the Cilley Graves duel of 1838, the only fatal duel between two sitting congressmen in American history. At least so far. But don't worry, there are plenty more stories of congressional violence out there, and I'm sure I'll get to all of them in time. But until then, I have been the Congressman. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think of my new set, and I will see you next time.